Shipwreck at the Bottom of the World, the extraordinary true story of Shackleton and the Endurance. Chapter 13, Passage to Elephant Island. The ocean that had chased them back and made them flee for the shelter of the ice pack is the worst ocean on the globe. The weather systems, the winds of up to 200 miles per hour that howl from Antarctica, are one reason it is so treacherous. The other reason is geography. Unlike the other continents, Antarctica is completely surrounded by ocean, and there is no significant land to obstruct the rushing waves. Ocean rollers can travel 12,000 miles around the globe at the 16th parallel and never bump into anything. The spinning of the earth causes these mighty waves to spiral endlessly to the east, building momentum as they go. They squeeze through Drake's Passage, the gap between the tip of South America and the end of the Antarctic Peninsula, a distance of only 620 miles. This bottleneck compacts the waves and gives them even more force. They can reach 100 feet in height from the bottom of the trough to the crest, and the distance from one wave to the next can measure a mile. They are huge walls of water bearing down on everything in its path at speeds of up to 50 miles per hour. When Sir Francis Drake first navigated through this perilous strait in 1578, it took him 16 days and cost him 4 of his ships. In addition to these waves, known as Cape Horn rollers, the Southern Ocean carries strange currents that often run against the prevailing winds, causing a broken, turbulent surface and stirring up storms, forcing the waves to mount even higher. Giant rogue waves can overtake and reinforce each other and often come in groups of 3. The ancient mariners gave them the superstitious name of Three Sisters Waves. The tiny outcroppings of rocks and lonesome islets in the extreme south are littered with wreckage of dead ships. A calm day on the Southern Ocean has swells of 15 feet. In the winter, the frigid air that flows north from the pole creates one cyclone after another and collides with warmer air from the tropics, spinning off gales, hurricanes, and blizzards. Spindrift, whipping off the crest of breaking waves, freezes into sleet. Water is hurled up in the sky and dashed back again. Winds scream over the waves. The sun retreats in horror. This is the Southern Ocean in winter. The 3 boats of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition ran from the force of the Southern Ocean back into the pack. After scouting around, the men landed the boats on a remnant of tabular ice, a large, flat, blue ice cube that rose about 20 feet from the surface of the water. At the lowest point, the berg was only 5 feet above the surface. The crew chucked the stores and equipment up, climbed up onto the ice, and hauled the boats after them. Everything in the boats had been soaked with flying spray and breaking waves, but they pitched their camp and crawled into their damp sleeping bags, nursing their blisters and frostbitten hands. They hadn't slept in 36 hours. As they slept, the gale increased, battering other floes against their bergs and chipping away at its edges. When they awoke on April 11th, their hearts sank. They were caught like rats in a trap. From one horizon to another, the loose pack had closed in around their camp. Massive 30-foot ocean rollers from the northwest spooled through the pack, lifting the ice and letting it fall again at half-mile intervals. It was as magnificent and beautiful of a sight as I have ever seen, Worsley said later, but it was the sight we did not like, for the floes were thudding against our flowberg with increasing violence. Our temporary home was being swept away at an unpleasantly rapid rate. The men could only watch helplessly as the mighty waves jostled the ice together. Launching the boats now would be suicidal, but chances they were about to be pitched into the water at any moment. Huge chunks of ice were breaking away from their berg all the time. Shackleton, Wild, and Worsley kept a lookout from the highest point of their berg, a 20-foot tall knoll. All morning they scanned the ocean around them, searching for open water as their floe was whittled down to the size of a tennis court. One lead after another passed them by too far away to reach. but then, 2 hours after noon, a good open lead reached them, just as their berg began rolling to the side. "Launch the boats!" Shackleton called out. "Chuck in the stores any old way!" Within few minutes, they were underway again, dodging their way through the sea of ice. For 2 hours they made steady progress at the oars, and then Shackleton judged the way clear enough to hoist sail. Immediately the James Caird sprang ahead, with the Dudley Docker nipping along in its wake, but the Stancomb Wills fell farther and farther astern. Shackleton, in the Caird, grew increasingly anxious as the third boat fell behind. Finally, he drew up in the lee of a large berg and shouted to Worsley to go back and help the other boat. Worsley brought the Docker around and beat back into the wind to take the Wills in tow. Night was falling quickly, but no one wanted to risk another close call like the one they had had that morning. They sailed into the shelter of a large floe and moored to it. Green climbed up onto the ice and got the stove going to boil up some milk, while several men in their boats mooed like impatient calves. Soon they all held steaming mugs of hot milk, and Green and the blubber stove were brought back on board. But no sooner had they warmed themselves with the milk then the wind shifted and brought dangerous chunks of ice crowding and bumping against their floe. The men pulled the chunks away from their oars as well as they could, but the danger of being holed by ice was too great. With tow ropes joining the three boats together, they cast off and rowed wearily from one floe to another throughout the night, trying to find some shelter. As the temperature sank below zero, the men took turns at the oars to keep warm. Rain turned to snow showers. It was a very long night. When the morning came, a northwest breeze brought warmer air, raising the temperature almost up to above freezing point, but with rain and sleet falling, the men were still covered in ice. At noon, the sky was clear enough for Worsley to take a sight. Braced against the mast of the Docker, he aligned his sextant with the horizon and shot the sun. The crew waited anxiously as he worked his calculations. He checked his figures, frowning, and checked them again. He looked up, crestfallen. "What have we made, skipper?" Shackleton called from the James Caird as he brought the boat alongside the Docker and jumped aboard. Worsley spoke low, so only the boss could hear. 30 miles astern, sir." A current had driven them backwards in spite of all their efforts. They were farther from their destination than when they had launched the boats at Patience Camp. Shackleton decided not to tell the men how bad it was. "We haven't done well as we expected," he told the crew, with dark looks at Worsley, as though they held the navigator responsible. The men brought their boats into the wind again and continued sailing. What else could they do? That night again they tried to take shelter in their boats in the lee of a large ice floe. But within hours of mooring themselves, the wind changed direction and began battering them against their shelter. The boats crackled loudly against the ice, grating and scraping on the edge of the floe. Shouting over the wind, the men fought their way off and into the open water again, where a heavy wet snow began falling on them. Around them the sea was stiffening as it froze, and the men could hear the snow crackle as it fell into the waves. The new sea ice hissed and creaked as it rose on the swell. For the rest of the night the men sat in their boats, their clothes freezing on them, huddling together for warmth. It was too cold for sleep. When the light dawned in the morning, they were like a company of ghosts, their faces drained and pale with strain, their beards and hair white with snow and salt spray. Shackleton ordered the sails raised and led the way through the loose pack and pancake ice again. Late in the morning they passed a stretch of ice where thousands of fish had been killed by a cold current. Now fulmars and petrels swooped down and bore them away. The frigid wind from the pole increased steadily, driving them northward until, almost without warning, they burst free from the pack and into the open ocean again. Huge ocean rollers swept toward them, and the three boats began clawing up waves whose faces were a quarter of a mile long. The gale force wind tore the crests from the strollers, covering the men and boats with a layer of ice. Before them was the Southern Ocean, and they were making for an island only 20 miles long and 100 miles away. The men prayed that Worsley's calculations were right. They were looking for a needle in a haystack. Beyond Elephant Island lay the 600 miles of Drake's Passage, with no landfall before South America. Waves broke over the bows of the boats, washing over the exhausted men. Now they had a new agony, a gagging, unbearable thirst. They had left the pack so suddenly that they had not had time to take ice on board for melting into water. Constantly drenched in salt water, the men began to dehydrate. Even without drinking, they had to urinate frequently because of the water absorbed through their skin. They were also tormented by diarrhea from the uncooked meat they had been forced to eat. The only way to relieve themselves was by hanging over the side of the boat as ice seas surged up against them. Shackleton suggested that all the hands eat as much as they could in compensation, but few of them could manage to choke down uncooked seal meat or dry sugar cubes, and some were too seasick even to try. Of the three boats, Wills was in the worst fix. It was the smallest and the least seaworthy. Hudson, who had the tiller, was on point of breaking. Shackleton and Worsley were terrified that the Wills would be lost in the night if they didn't tether it to their boats. As darkness fell on the ocean, the three boats tied themselves together, and the docker put out a sea anchor to keep them turned up into the wind. They had to wait another night without sleep. The temperature dropped and the wind kept up, sluicing water over their bows. The men's feet were swamped with cold water. As they began to lose feeling, they started wiggling their toes inside their waterlogged boots to keep the blood circulating. With every moment the men made, ice crackled off their clothing. Some of the men began to cry in their despair. Some shouted curses to the wind that cracked through their cracked and frostbitten lips. The fear of killer whales tangling in their lines began to prey on some of the men's minds, and all of them could feel the motion of the boats growing clumsier and heavier as the ice built up on them. They were shipping water constantly. The men took turns hacking ice off the thwarts and bows, and bailing to keep the small boats from floundering. Gradually, in the small hours of the morning, the wind stopped flaying them and began to taper off. When the sun finally rose in a brilliant pink sky, it shone on 28 men who were more dead than alive. Salt water boils on their faces were breaking open and dripping across the dead white rings of frostbite. Their eyes were sunken and red, and they had the wild look of men driven to the end of their ropes with pain and exposure. But dead ahead, no more than 30 miles away, rose the snow-covered basalt peaks of Elephant Island. Some of the men laughed, nearly hysterical. In a cracked voice, the boss ordered the sea anchor brought in. By the impossibly beautiful light of the sunrise, he looked like an old man. Worsley noted it with shock. Somehow Shackleton had always seemed invincible, but even the boss had been beaten hard by the terrible night. With luck, however, they would be on land by the next nightfall. A steady breeze filled their sails, but to the men it didn't drive them fast enough. They shoved their oars into the water again, and with land in sight, found strength they did not know they had. Some of them chewed raw seal meat to swallow the blood and ease their parched throats. Most of them had not slept in more than 3 days, but they could see the end of their ordeal over the breaking waves. The James Caird still towed the clumsy Wills for safety, and the docker dragged itself forward in the lead. Black Barrow had lost all feeling in his feet. There was almost nothing anyone could do for him, but Dr. McElroy massaged the young man's feet, trying to restore the circulation. Greenstreet and Macklin also took off their boots and found their feet frostbitten, but they rubbed their toes until they felt the searing pain of blood flowing through their veins. Steadily throughout the day, the three boats drew nearer and nearer to Elephant Island, but by 2 in the afternoon, they were less than 10 miles away. But at 3 o'clock they hadn't gotten any closer. They were in a grip of current that held them off the island. To make matters worse, the wind shifted around and began holding them off as well. The sails were lowered hastily, and the men redoubled their efforts at the oars. It was too cruel to believe, but they could not get any closer to the island. As darkness began to fall at 5:30, the wind shifted once again and quickly blew up into a gale, tearing the tops off the waves. Worsley shouted to Shackleton that their best hope now lay in separating. He was having trouble keeping the nimble Dudley Docker back with the other two boats. Reluctantly, Shackleton agreed, although he refused to release the tether that kept the Willis with the Caird. He was sure that if he let the smaller boat go, it would never be seen again. The wind ripped clouds across the face of the moon. By the faint light, Worsley steered the Docker toward Elephant Island and was soon lost to sight. It was night, and they were still in the boats. The men were sick with disappointment. Some of them lay senseless and numb on the brink of losing their minds. Shackleton feared that some of the men would die if they didn't make landfall soon. Once during the night he called out into the darkness to the Willis, "Blackbarrow!" "Hey, here, sir," came a weak reply. "We shall be on Elephant Island tomorrow," the boss shouted. "No one has ever landed there before, and you will be the first ashore." Blackbarrow did not answer. He had long since lost all feeling in his feet and doubted he would ever land anywhere else, first or last. On the Docker, the men were clawing their way toward the island in heavy seas. The boat pitched and rolled wildly as waves smashed into its broadside. Worsley had only one compass left, and he lighted a match to check that they were still headed in the right direction. The island itself was lost in the darkness. Cheatham had been smoking, but his pipe had gone out, and he begged a match from Worsley to relight. The other men let out a storm of protest as using up their precious matches. "Look here, I'll sell you one," Worsley said. "Right, sir. What price?" the third officer asked. With a hoarse laugh, Worsley replied, "A bottle of champagne." "Done, sir. As soon as I get back to the hall and open my little pub, the champagne's yours." They sat through the rest of the night, bailing, rowing, and cursing. Worsley, who had been at the tiller for more than 50 hours, finally pitched forward in a dead faint. Greenstreet took the tiller and prayed he would stay on the right course. When the morning dawned, foggy and squally, they were right up under the island's towering black cliffs, and a violent squall tore down the side of the mountain, slamming into the boat. "Wake Worsley!" Greenstreet cried. The men tried to rouse the skipper, calling and shaking him, but he seemed to be dead. McLeod gave Worsley a couple of hard kicks to the head. Instantly, Worsley sat up and croaked, "Keep her away 4 points." Waves thundered against the rocks, throwing spray into the air and falling back with a hiss. Worsley steered the boat westward, searching for a landing site. Dominican gulls sailed up the black peaks, disappearing into the fog. By 9:30, the crew of the Docker still hadn't found a beach, and there was no sight of the other two boats. "Poor blighters," Greenstreet whispered. "Sure, the Caird and the Wills were lost at sea. They're gone." Then they rounded a spit, and ahead of them were the other boats, standing off in the surf where a reef sent breakers crashing up into the air. A narrow tongue of land made a landing beach at the base of the cliffs. The feeble shouts of the men as the Docker were lost in the pounding of the waves. Shackleton waited for an opening in the surf and then gave a shout for the men to pull their last strength through the reef. Shingle scraped beneath the bow of the boat, ground up onto the shore. "Jump ashore, Blackbarrow," Shackleton urged, determined to give his youngest crewman the honor of first landing. Blackbarrow didn't move. Impatient, Shackleton reached out and dragged the boy up by his arms and hoisted him over the side. Blackbarrow fell to his hands and knees, and a breaking wave toppled over him. "Get up," Shackleton ordered. "I can't, sir," the boy replied. In a flood of shame, Shackleton remembered that Blackbarrow's feet were frozen. He motioned Howe and Bakewell over the side to help the young man onto shore. One by one, the boats surged up onto the rocky beach, and the crew stumbled through the water on solid ground for the first time in 16 months. Wild stepped out of the Caird beside Shackleton, as easy and unconcerned as if he had stepped out of his car for a stroll in the park. the boss recalled later. But most of the men were not as calm as Wild. Many of them began weeping and laughing at the same time, falling to their hands and knees to pick up the black pebbles and let them trickle through their hands. They had landed.